Good afternoon or good evening, one and all. You're tuned in to the China History Podcast. Laszlo Montgomery here. Thanks to all new prescribers to my Patreon and CHP Premium. I appreciate your support of this long-running family program, already in its 14th year. Before we pick up with the adventures of Wu Sangui, I wanted to mention just one more person from the Ming, who I should have mentioned last time. This was Yang Shen. He was Yunnan's most famous literary figure of his day, and is also one of the Ming Dai San Caizi, the three literary greats of the Ming, the other two being Xie Jin and Xu Wei. Yang Shen, he lived 1488 to 1559. He came from a renowned family of scholar officials and showed amazing promise, just like his contemporary Wang Yangming. Yang Shen famously placed first in the imperial exams and got off to a blazing start in the government, but he preferred the scholarly life to the bureaucratic life, and with the accession of the Qing Emperor to the throne, he became very disillusioned with government. He wound up on the losing side in the Great Rights Controversy, and the fun-loving Qing Emperor banished Yang Shen to western Yunnan in Yongzheng, present-day Baoshan, southwest of Dali. At first, Yang Shen was filled with despair and dreaded being in such a far-off, mosquito-infested place as Yunnan. He was banished there, but it wasn't like he was under house arrest or anything. He went back and forth to his home province of Sichuan, where his family lived. But Yang Shen was banished to Yunnan for the remainder of his days and came to quite love the place, as many transplants do today. The long-reigning Qing Emperor outlived Yang Shen, so there was no reprieve waiting for him from the succeeding emperor. But from the 2,300 poems written during his Yunnan period, we can see his appreciation for the best that Yunnan had to offer. And from his poetry, we get an additional window into Yunnan's scenic landscape painting-worthy naturescapes. So he was quite enamored with Yunnan and did much to create this image in the minds of many Chinese people of that day about Yunnan's natural beauty and the specialness of this province of China. Okay, let's continue on with Wu Sangui, who, besides giving up the Ming Dynasty for dead, famously opened the gates at Shanhaiguan for Dogon and the Manchu army on May 22, 1644, and made matters much easier for the Manchu bannermen to invade China proper and take over the country. Wu Sangui, I'd call him an A-lister from Qing history. He's often criticized for his betrayal of the Ming Dynasty, but when he had to make that hard choice, the Ming Chongzhen Emperor had already hung himself from behind the Forbidden City, and Li Zicheng, well, he hadn't torched the Forbidden City yet. He'd commit that foul deed on June 4th after declaring himself the new emperor of the Qing Dynasty. But Li Zicheng was already wreaking havoc on the capital, so a guy like Wu Sangui, he probably figured he'd take his chances with the Manchus over this Shanxi peasant rebel Li Zicheng. We saw how Wu Sangui, in the service of the Qing Dynasty, hunted down the southern Ming Emperor Yongle, and in this act, he snuffed out this last wildfire for the Qing, and as a cherry on top, in May 1662, Wu Sangui participated personally in the southern Ming Emperor's execution in Kunming, then called Yunnan Fu. After 18 years, the Qing court was pretty sure they had finally seen the last of the Ming Dynasty and their loyalists. So Wu Sangui was riding very high in the saddle, you can say, and for a job well done, the regency ruling for the child Kangxi Emperor handed Yunnan province to this great man, naming him the Pingxi Wang, the king or prince who pacifies the West. And to honor him even more, the Qing imperial court, later on, of course, allowed one of Wu Sangui's sons to marry one of the Kangxi Emperor's daughters. Was that thankfulness or what? The whole province of Yunnan, a fancy title, his family marrying into royalty, and any time Wu Sangui requested money, subsidies, or wanted to charge anything on the Kangxi Emperor's credit card, they let him. They didn't micromanage him either. They let him administer things in Yunnan without too much interference. And when the Miao or Yi people rose up against Qing control and interference in their tribal affairs, Wu Sangui would go in and put out those fires. But this was another one of those same bed, different dreams situations. Wu Sangui was thinking he was the ruler of this vassal kingdom of Yunnan, and when he died, he passed the Pingxi Wang title down to his son, who would pass it down to his son, like a dynasty. But what the Kangxi Emperor was thinking was, well, the Qing, they needed to catch a breather after all those years of getting rid of all that resistance to their rule. And Wu Sangui, well, he was just a place mark, just somebody to hold the province together until the Qing military was replenished, refreshed, and ready to take over direct control of Yunnan province. And by the 1670s, that time had come. The Revolt of the Three Feudatories was one of the headline acts of the early Qing, and Wu Sangui played in the lead role. There were two other rebel leaders who provided similar services to the Qing and were amply rewarded in a similar fashion as Wu Sangui. Geng Ming threw his lot in with the Manchus, and for all the military services he performed in Manchuria, in Shanxi against Li Zicheng, and then in Fujian, where he pacified all resistance to Qing rule, the emperor gave him the title of Jingnan Wang, the prince who pacifies the south. The only thing about Geng Ming is that he got written out of the script rather early in 1649, and his son, Geng Chi Mao, took his place. And he ran things in Fujian till his death in 1671 and duly passed down his title to his son, Geng Jingzhong. I know that's a lot of Gengs to remember. This one, Geng Jingzhong, is the one who fought in the Revolt of the Three Feudatories. The third great man who cast his lot early on with the Qing was Shang Ke. He earned the gratitude of the Qing court for all the good deeds he did for them down in Guangdong province, chasing down the southern Ming loyalists. And he too was honored with the title of Pingnan Wang, the prince who pacifies the south. Now, since Fujian and Guangdong are both in the south of China, Shang Ke was given the same title as Geng Ming, same in English, but different character in Chinese. The history of the Revolt of the Three Feudatories has been discussed in more than a couple past CHP episodes, so I only want to focus on the Yunnan part here. These three military men were all given a fan, a feudatory. Wu Sangui, like I said, got Yunnan, Shang Ke got Guangdong, and Geng Ming got Fujian. Now, area-wise, from an American perspective, that's equivalent to South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And you could throw Rhode Island in there, too. It wasn't a small fiefdom the Qing Dynasty handed to these three guys. The armies of all three of these feudatories combined outnumbered the Qing military. So that was one problem that kept the upper crust of the Qing imperial court up at night. And Wu Sangui got to live like an emperor in Yunnan, and Kangxi had to foot the bill. So there came a time in 1673 that Shang Ke resigned his position as a feudatory. And the other two feudatories, they didn't like that. They knew such an act put them in a kind of difficult position, and surely the Kangxi Emperor was going to come to them and suggest they resign as well, like their fellow Fan Wang or feudatory. So Shang Ke, returning his feudatory of Guangdong back to the emperor, well, that was the opening salvo to what followed. Wu Sangui reached out to Shang Ke's son, who never agreed with his father about giving their feudatory back to the emperor. So this son, Shang Zhixin, he agreed to team up with Wu Sangui in this revolt. And the grandson of the original feudatory of Fujian, Geng Jingzhong, he too joined, and they proclaimed their mission was to tear down the Qing and restore the Ming. You can imagine how the Kangxi Emperor felt at this time, all of 19 years old. Since he began his reign at age 7, all his efforts had been spent consolidating the regime and wiping out the last vestiges of their dynastic predecessor. And just when he thought the Ming Dynasty was finally dead and buried, it's like Max Cady in Cape Fear just kept coming back to haunt the Manchus. And how ironic. Wu Sangui, he got a lot of credit for his role in extinguishing the Ming, and now here he was calling for its restoration. This 8-year civil war, it didn't end well for the Three Feudatories. Wu Sangui, I was pretty sure he was going to end up on top, so in 1678 he jumped the gun and founded his own dynasty, yet another Zhou dynasty, except this one was the Great Zhou, the Da Zhou. First, there was the original Zhou dynasty of ancient times and the northern Zhou of 557-581. Then Wu Zetian established her Zhou dynasty, the Wu Zhou, from 690 to 705. And there was another Zhou dynasty, the Hou Zhou, the later Zhou that followed the demise of the Tang. And now Wu Sangui brought this sacred dynasty name back for a fifth time. And the capital was located in southern Hunan, in Hengyang, a place I used to frequent every now and then back in the early 1990s. Except back then, no one told me this was where Wu Sangui put his capital. Actually, there were 6 Zhou dynasties. I didn't mention Jiang Shicheng's state that he set up during the Red Turban Rebellion, 1354 to 1367. Anyway, Wu Sangui's Zhou dynasty was the shortest lasting of them all, and he died 7 months into his reign on October 2nd, 1678. And his grandson took over as emperor, but 1681, he too fell to the Qing army, and so livid was the Kangxi emperor. You don't want to know what he had his men do with Wu Sangui's corpse after they got their hands on it. Where Yunnan is concerned, most China general history books tend to jump straight from the end of the Revolt of the Three Feudatories to the Panthay Rebellion, but there's plenty to say about Yunnan in the 18th century during the Yongzheng and Qianlong eras, the best years of the Qing. Han Chinese migration to Yunnan greatly increased in the Ming, but during the Qing, especially during the 1700s, the stream of migrants from the east and from the north became a torrent. The Qing military now had a sizable presence down there, and soldiers based in Yunnan brought their wives and children with them. And there were also the many officials and petty bureaucrats who worked in the provincial government. And there were also countless Han merchants and entrepreneurs who had migrated to Yunnan in search of riches. There were also a lot of Thai people in Yunnan. They existed in even greater numbers next door in Guangxi. Thai, T-A-I, included the Dai people in Yunnan. There were others in the Shan state of northern Myanmar, all over Thailand and Laos, Vietnam. And these Thai people all share a common branch of the Thai Kadai language family. And these languages differed from the other languages of that region, Mon Khmer, Miao Yao, and Sino-Tibetan. In Yunnan, among the many ethnic minorities, the Dai were a very sophisticated people. This was evident in their political organization, for one, and in their literacy. They had their own writing system, wrote their own histories that offered an alternative to the Sinocentric historiographers of the dynasties. They had diplomatic and trade relations with other surrounding peoples, and they had their own aristocracy and aristocratic culture. And the Dai were mainly concentrated in the south and southwest of Yunnan. Up to now, we've mainly looked at the north of Yunnan, where Kunming is, Lake Dian, the Dian Kingdom, and Dali, who's located in the northwest. In this episode, we're going to travel to South Yunnan, to one of the homelands of the Dai people. And the epicenter of this part of the Dai heartland is Xishuangbanna, also known as Sipsongpanna. The inhabitants of this southernmost part of Yunnan went back thousands of years. In the Chinese chronicles, this town was an old stop on the ancient Tea-Horse Road. Tea trees grew in these mountains of southern Yunnan, bordering Laos and Vietnam, for tens of thousands of years. Much more about that later. In 1722, something big happened. The Kangxi Emperor died. So long had he lived, the Yongzheng Emperor was already 44 when he sat himself down on the dragon throne. After the defeat of the Three Feudatories, the Qing court continued to rely heavily on these almost 300 tribal chieftains to handle the administration and maintenance of the towns and villages of the mountain and river valleys of Yunnan. The Ming first stepped into the shoes of the Yuan, and now the Qing were wearing the Ming's shoes, and they all continued to utilize variations of this same old Tu Si system that went back to Mongol times. A good portion of our story today concerns the Yongzheng Emperor's best friend and closest confidant, it's said. He was a Manchu aristocrat from a different banner than the ruling Gyoro clan, and this great and eminent man's name in Chinese was È'ěrtài. In all the English language history books, he's called Ortai. Now, prior to his time in Yunnan, he served as vice governor of Jiangsu, and then he was made the Yungui Zongdu, the viceroy of Yunnan and Guizhou, often abbreviated as Yungui. In fact, Ortai's actually more remembered for hammering Miao rebels in Guizhou than for his 5 years in Yunnan from 1726 to 1731. And Guizhou had been turned into a province in 1413. Ortai was able to convince the Yongzheng Emperor that times had changed and the Qing imperial government needed to bring some of that frontier land more directly under the control of the China center. In other words, the objective was to retire all these Tu Si local tribal rulers with Qing-appointed officials and administrators. And once that had been accomplished, it would be much easier to levy taxes and carry out government takeovers of profitable businesses like salt and, especially in this part of the world, the tea. The policy that Ortai was pushing to Yongzheng was called Gai Tu Gui Liu, which meant changing out the local chieftains for a more traditional bureaucratic system with the ultimate objective of frontier security and turning on the tax revenue spigots. Ortai goes down in Chinese history as one of the more notorious past conquerors and tamers of indigenes and other peoples on China's periphery. He spent about 5 years in Yunnan cracking his whip and pacifying the indigenous people in ways we're all familiar with, some of us in our own countries. The non-Han Chinese population of Yunnan were really chafing from all the vigorous attempts at Sinicization, and this was also true in Guizhou, Guangxi, and western Sichuan. Aggressive action was taken by the government to muscle in on the salt trade in the south. There are 3 cities running north to south: Zhenyuan, Weiyuan, and Pu'er, and then there's Sipsongpana that ran to the Lao-Vietnam border. Now today, if you drove by car, the distance from Zhenyuan to Sipsongpana is a 4.5 hour drive. Not that great of a distance, 300 kilometers. That's where all the action took place that I'm going to mention now. Now these 2 places were and remain today heavily populated by Dai and Yi people, and by others as well. They revolted against Qing authorities there over a number of issues, not least of which was their heavy-handedness in the salt trade and all the new taxes. Things got out of hand, violence broke out. There weren't enough Qing boots on the ground at first, so additional soldiers were sent first to Weiyuan, north of Pu'er, and then these salt wars, as they were called, of 1723 to 1726, was what brought Ortai down there in the first place. And from 1726 to 1735, the local indigenous people, who more than 1,000 years before had Yunnan practically all to themselves, had to endure the disadvantages of being in an inferior military position. Ortai arrived in 1726 and promptly rolled out the reforms carried out in Weiyuan to other places. Zhenyuan was next, and in no time at all, new revenue sources for the imperial treasury started flowing in on a regular basis. Frontier security had been beefed up, and the spread of Chinese and imperial culture continued, as well as the flip side to that objective, the suppression of indigenous ways and cultures. By 1727, Ortai had used the full force of his army to halt all resistance in Zhenyuan and Weiyuan. But as soon as this was quashed, further south in Sipsongpana, or Xishuangbanna, located at the bottom of Yunnan, they too were paid a visit by Ortai to put down a revolt. Now, the reason they were up in arms down in this part of southern Yunnan were the Dai people were the most prominent and concerned tea. Now, as I mentioned just a bit ago, tea trees grew wild in these parts, and as we all know from all those tea history episodes, folks down in Xishuangbanna had been neck-deep in the tea trade since the time of the Six Dynasties period, and probably even before. You could even call this part of planet Earth the epicenter of the original tea garden as it existed before humankind. Although the world-renowned and beloved Pu'er tea contained the Pu'er label, it didn't actually come from Pu'er. That was just the place where the growers brought their tea leaves from the celebrated and mythical Liudacha Shan, the 6 great tea mountains of the Dai Autonomous Region in Sipsongpana, or again, Xishuangbanna. These 6 great tea mountains were called Gedeng, Manzhuan, Mangzhi, Mansa, Youle, and Yibangshan. There's another 6 that are also considered great in the Chinese definition of the word da, located outside the Lancang River system. The Lancang runs right through Xishuangbanna before it continues on, marking the border between Laos and Myanmar and winding south along the Thai-Cambodian borders before emptying out in the delta that bears the more familiar name for this river, the Mekong. So this southern part of Yunnan, this is where all the Pu'er tea comes from. The raw leaves anyway, the Mao Cha, after the Dai and Han tea pickers worked their way through these mountains and filled up their tea baskets. The tea merchants took it all off their hands and brought it to Simao in Pu'er. And that was where all the leaves would be processed using centuries of tradition and experience that knew how to turn those famous Yunnan Da Ye big leaf tea into a finished product that was as much a necessity of life back then as cooking oil or salt. Tea cultivation may have begun with the 7 tea plants on Mengdingshan and Sichuan with Wu Lijun in 53 BC, but the Dai and other aboriginal peoples of these parts were long familiar with Camellia sinensis before then. Pu'er tea, the kind that experts will say is the king of teas, all comes from around this southern Yunnan region and nowhere else. Anyway, back to the story. All the evidence suggested the violence meted out by the Dai, Han and Jino native peoples had been provoked by their Han Chinese trade partners who had either treated them unfairly or went against the established way of doing things. And it was for this that Ortai came down hard on them. After they had killed a number of Han tea merchants and went on to indiscriminately murder more Han Chinese, and after a respected Dai aristocrat was called in to adjudicate in the matter, and then rather than assist the Qing in calming the situation, he turned his soldiers on them. Both sides called each other the instigator, and there was probably some truth in that. But whatever mitigating circumstances there may have been, the local people were forced to feel the pain of Ortai's iron fist, and using a lesson from the colonist's handbook. In his reports back to the Yongzheng Emperor, Ortai used the most disparaging and insulting expressions to describe the indigenous people and to present them in the worst possible light, likening them to savages as opposed to the Chinese standard for what constituted a civilized person back then. And because the Han people had led this revolt against the Qing, called the Tea Wars, the tribal leaders and their families were singled out for special treatment so that everyone could tremble at the might of the Qing Empire. Ortai went on to transform the administration and government of the southernmost part of Yunnan province, and this included the creation of Pu'er Prefecture. So Ortai set out to tame this Sipsongpana region, and in 1729, that he did. And he convinced the emperor to beef up the military presence down there, as well as other recommendations to enhance the Qing presence in Yunnan. And as far as the tea business went, starting from that point, the Qing government stepped in and took it over, regulated it and taxed it, and they set up a zongcha dian, or a general tea market, to deal with the bulk buying and selling. It was a big money spinner for the Manchus, as were the salt and grain taxes that flowed from Yunnan to the Qing coffers. In 1731, Ortai rode off into the sunset and went on to serve the Qing in other military and civil roles. He was a major figure of his day. And he left with the Qing firmly in control in Yunnan. But the seething resentment remained, and it bubbled to the surface from time to time. Not 1 year after Ortai left, in 1732, there was a rather significant incident down in Sipsongpana that lasted for 3 months. Dai and other hill tribes went out and occupied various towns and harassed Han tea merchants. It all ended with the Dai rebel leader's head on a pike on display for all to see. So this period of conquest in Yunnan that lasted from 1723 to 1735, it caused quite a bit of unrest and long-lasting resentment. While the Qing takeover of Yunnan was a difficult one, they did have military superiority. As lethal as these diseases were that had been decimating outsiders for the longest time, they did overcome all these difficulties. And after a while, the Qing officials learned these Aboriginal people couldn't be defeated militarily. All the Qing presence could do was tamp down on all the revolts against their authority as they happened, and they never let up. And besides, when Emperor Yongzheng passed away in 1735, his aggressive policies in Yunnan died with him. His son, the Qianlong Emperor, wasn't as harsh. Even in Sipsongpana, local rule shifted back to Dai aristocrats, and the Qing court found that allying with these Dai beat fighting them in the mountains, and the heavy Qing presence in Sipsongpana moved up north to Simao in Pu'er Prefecture. And today, Simao is a district of Pu'er. There was also a copper crisis in the 18th century. Coinage in China among the masses involved copper cash. Copper was imported from Japan because they couldn't mine enough in China at that time. In 1715, Japanese policies changed and less copper was exported. So facing this crimp in the supply chain, the government turned to the mines in Yunnan in order to keep the copper supply sufficient enough to allow the treasury to mint enough coinage. And for a country that ran on copper coinage, Yunnan quietly provided the natural resource that facilitated the continued prosperity of the Qing Dynasty. And into the Qianlong period, as the Qing officials began to feel around the edges of Yunnan, trying to get a handle on their latest conquest, they fell back on the same old methods of past centuries, making alliances with local tribal chieftains who handled all the affairs going on in Yunnan for the Qing center in Beijing. Now, during the Ming, after an intensive period of migration to Yunnan, the Han Chinese made up about a third of the province's population. But by the mid to late Qing, the number of Han residents reached 60%, and all these native people who had called various parts of Yunnan their home since before the time of the Yellow Emperor, they found themselves slotted in the Shaoshu Minzu category. They were ethnic minority people now. If you recall, thanks to all the good times in China during the three emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, there was a population spike, the likes of which that had not been seen in a long time. We're all familiar with the social and economic consequences of this population explosion in southern Guangdong among the Hakkas and Bunde native Cantonese people who were fighting to the death over land. Peasants, merchants, and pioneers from elsewhere in China, who looked favorably on the prospects in the southwest, came in numbers never seen before. And copper being such a critical resource for the Qing economy, well, you could be sure it was tightly government-controlled. Besides copper and silver, Yunnan had deposits of gold, tin, and lead, which early on allowed them to make things from bronze. In fact, there are theories that maintain all these Shang and Zhou dynasty bronzes were made from metals transported from Yunnan to the Yellow River Valley. And the mining business, as we can see from past history, and even today, the mineral-rich havens on the planet, well, that's a rough business run by tough people, and mining was a huge industry in Yunnan, and miners fought and killed each other in Yunnan just like they did elsewhere in the world during these bad old days of the mid-19th century. In a serious attempt to finally phase out cowrie shells as the local currency, the Ming began minting copper coins in Yunnan in 1555. But local resistance in Yunnan made it very slow going. I mean, just look at how much resistance there still is in American society, cutting the cord with cash. Well, it was the same in Yunnan. After a few thousand years, the people got used to this cowrie shell money. But into the Qing, finally, copper cash became the main source of money down there. Next episode, I was going to introduce the Panthay Rebellion, but before we go there, I wanted to first discuss some of the historical background about the Muslim presence in Yunnan. For those of you who follow China news and events, Yunnan's Muslim community has been in the news lately. This is June 2023 as I'm recording this. Because of the government action to partially dismantle portions of the Najiaying Mosque in Yuxi, part of Tonghai County. I mentioned Tonghai County last time in part 2. A lot of Mongol troops had been stationed there 500-600 years ago, and those who survived the Ming takeover of Yunnan remain there. Anyway, the current controversy concerns this mosque built back in 1370, right at the start of the Ming. New government regulations implemented several years ago dictated how mosques could be constructed. No domes or minarets were allowed. And in defiance of this law, these local Yuxi Hui residents did just that. So the news story concerns the protests that are going on there right now to defy the government efforts to tear down these illegal structures. So this story has been recently popping up in news feeds of anyone subscribing to any of the China-watching newsletters and podcasts. So let's jump backwards 3 or 4 centuries ago and get a small taste of some historical context to this news item. This Yuxi area is predominantly populated by Hui Chinese. The Hui are Han Chinese Muslims. Today there's only about 20,000 Hui in Yunnan. They speak Chinese. They're like any other Han Chinese in most ways, except they're from Muslim families and have their own traditional lifestyle, with Islam being central to their culture. A lot of Muslim people came to China during the earliest beginnings of Islam, in the Tang and during the Mongol Yuan Dynasty. Today, the Hui people comprise the 3rd largest group of minority people in China. But Islam only took hold in Yunnan in the 1270s, thanks to one man in particular, and this was Sayyid Ajall Shams al-Din Omar al-Bukhari. In the Chinese histories, they refer to him as Sai Dian Chi Shan Si Ding. He came from an eminent family from Bukhara, as his name suggests. His father had early gained the favor of Genghis Khan for surrendering to him early in the Mongol conquest, and his armies went on to fight for the Mongols. Ajall Shams al-Din Omar fought for Kublai Khan and Dali, and following the conquest of this kingdom in 1274, the Yunnan administrative province was established under the Yuan Dynasty. And for his loyalty and reliability whenever called upon, Kublai Khan appointed Ajall Shams al-Din Omar Yunnan's first provincial governor, and he established his government in the present-day provincial capital of Kunming. He only served for a short time, 1274 to 1279, but he was someone on a great mission, and he was in a hurry to make progress. Historians consider Sayyid Ajall Shams al-Din Omar the great ancestor of the Hui people in China, and not just in Yunnan. This also included Ningxia, Gansu, and Xinjiang. Admiral Zheng He, he was descended from Sayyid Ajall Shams al-Din Omar, and because he had that honorific surname, Sayyid, it meant he himself was descended from the Prophet Muhammad. So he's remembered for his service to the Mongols in Yunnan and for furthering his two main missions. First was the spread of Islam throughout Yunnan, and he succeeded there. Ajall Shams al-Din Omar is also remembered for his vigorous embrace of Confucianism and the establishment of a great number of schools that taught a classical Confucian education. He built the first Confucian temple in Yunnan. Mosques were constructed as well, and it was a very enlightened period, in line with the general tolerance the Yuan emperors had within their empire. Ajall Shams al-Din Omar believed Confucianism and education would combine to become the one great civilizing force in Yunnan. And upon his death in 1279, his son, Nasir al-Din, took over as Yunnan's second governor. He had a Chinese name too, Nasu-la Ding, and he finished up what his father had begun with respect to the pacification of Yunnan for the Yuan Dynasty. And when Marco Polo passed through Yunnan, he mentioned Nasir al-Din and the large Muslim population there. By the end of the Yuan, as the Hui population grew in Yunnan, the Han differentiated them from the indigenous people. They weren't considered indigenous, but they also weren't categorized as Han. They were classified as Han Hui. This set them apart from the two groups of the Han and the indigenes, who all got lumped together in one Chinese character. This character Yi at first was the character used in Zhou Dynasty times, but was later replaced with the character for the Yi people, the Yizu. So the role of the Hui in Yunnan, as far as their assistance to the Mongols in incorporating this conquest into their empire and fully integrating Yunnan into the rest of historic China proper, was well known to all. And in such high esteem were these Hui Chinese held at first, who were all mostly descended from Sayyid Ajall Shams al-Din Omar. They were used extensively by the imperial court throughout the Ming and early Qing in all kinds of civilian and military roles. And not just that, when you look at Ming porcelain, you could also see motifs and designs that had been inspired or copied from Islamic art. And throughout this period, Arab envoys had been regular visitors to the capital. So let me briefly try and explain a little more history about the Hui people. The term Hui, it only goes back to the Yuan Dynasty. All the Arabs who settled in the northwest of China or in Guangdong or Fujian, they weren't Hui. The Hui label only began with these new Muslim communities who followed in the wake of Ajall Shams al-Din Omar. During his brief period as governor of Yunnan, he had done so much to attract so many Persian and Turkic Muslims from Western and Central Asia. And these 13th and 14th century Central Asian Muslims, after 2-3 generations of intermarriage and sinification, well, it led them to share many basic similarities with the Han Chinese. They spoke Chinese, or whatever the prevailing Chinese dialect was. They wore the same fashions as Chinese. Physically, there wasn't any noticeable difference. They had their own customs, but they shared a high degree of common Chinese culture as Yunnan's Han Chinese. The Hui assimilated more naturally into Chinese society than their fellow Turkic or Persian Muslims in China's northwest provinces. And besides that, the Hui tended to more actively embrace Confucianism, the civil service exams, and performing government service. The Hui became deeply assimilated into Chinese culture, but kept their identity distinct from the Han by maintaining their own religious practices, such as the tradition of the Hajj or the pilgrimage to Mecca and the translation of important Arabic texts into Chinese. Their strict intermarriage practices were viewed as immoral, and like others around the world, even where you live maybe, people who share a common culture, well, they tend to flock together. Humans do that to varying degrees, and the Hui were no different. They lived together, did business together, went to the mosque together, and they also dominated the leather tanning and mining businesses. Yuan rulers recognized the Hui as having a higher standing in the emperor's court than the Han, and Islam was officially labeled by the Yuan as the Qing Dynasty, the pure and true religion, due to Mongol preference. And as a result, it could be said that the most important Muslim communities in China formed under the Mongol conquest, from the eastward migration of the Persian and Turkic peoples who later became designated as the Hui. In the Ming, the Muslims flourished under a tolerant Han government. Muslims held trusted and key positions in the Ming government, with Zheng He being the most famous example. And the Hui peoples were resettled in the frontier areas of China as buffer communities in the northwest and southwest, and the tolerance and inclusivity of Chinese Muslims in the Ming Dynasty was such that many Hui that followed referred to this time as the Golden Age of Islam in China. But come the waning years of Qianlong's overly long reign, long after he had allowed He Shun to do his damage, great changes were happening in Yunnan. Remember when I said how the Han migration to the southwest really turned into a flood of humanity in the Qing? Well, this was that time. The population explosion I mentioned brought the number of people in Yunnan from 4 million in 1775 to around 10 million in the 1850s. And right around here, things began to sour for Yunnan's Muslims. This new wave of Han migration brought in vast numbers of farmers, scholars, and merchants who lacked the general amity, or at worst, the good-natured contempt that the Yunnanese had for their longtime Hui Chinese fellow residents. After a period of intense migration that continued into the 1800s, tensions between the Hui and the new Han Chinese, calling Yunnan home, reached dangerous levels. And as these petty squabbles over land use or mining rights and other matters of commerce turned into bloody arguments, the Han officials in Yunnan had to pick a side, their fellow Hui residents or this new great wave of Han Chinese settlers. Into the 1820s and 30s, the Hui found themselves under attack by Qing soldiers called in to push back against their protesting. On October 2nd, 1845, the city of Baoshan, as I mentioned at the outset, the old Chinese city of Yongzheng, Qing officials there carried out a Xicheng campaign. Xi means to clean, and Cheng means a city. So on that date, they locked the gates to the city, and officials, with the aid of local secret societies, cleansed the city of all Muslims. About 8,000 Muslim Yunnanese died, many who had been living there for more than 500 years. The Yunnan provincial government intervened in the matter, and upon completing their investigation, they found the Hui responsible. So when things like this start happening, it's almost never that they turn out well for the aggrieved party in the minority. And all this anti-Hui violence and outrages committed against them, and provincial officials looking the other way or being complicit, ultimately exploded in what became known as the Panthay Rebellion. And that, my fine friends, is going to be what we'll focus on next time. So, on that exciting note, let's slip the bookmark in and draw the curtains until next time. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. Please please me and consider coming back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.